Well, let us turn in our Bibles to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and chapter 11. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and chapter 11. In his very good book on 1 Corinthians, David Jackman introduces his commentary on this chapter with these words, quote, he says, there are two major difficulties frequently encountered in Bible study. Some passages are hard to understand and so engage the mind at full stretch as we try to work out their meaning. Other passages are hard to accept and so engage the will at full stretch as we try to respond to them in obedience. But this passage comes into both categories, so that as we approach it, we need to do so in humility and dependence on God, expressed in prayer, that He will be pleased to make its message clear and plain to us, and give us grace to put it into practice. End of quote. Although I agree with Jackman that this passage does fall into both categories, I do sometimes wonder which of the two categories it falls into most. What is our greatest difficulty with this passage? Is it the difficulty of understanding it? Or is it the difficulty of accepting it and putting it into practice? Why is it that up until the 1960s and 70s, evangelical Christians in Britain apparently had no problem with this passage, whereas since then we have treated this passage very differently? Was it that all of a sudden in the 1960s the problems in understanding this passage became insurmountable? Or was it that other trends in British society around that time started to influence our attitude to and our interpretation of this portion of God's Word? I'll leave you to come to your conclusion on that one. But in the meantime, I'll try and explain the meaning and the continuing relevance of these verses. And the first thing we are going to consider this morning is the biblical principle of headship. The biblical principle of headship. As we've worked our way through this letter, we've heard Paul correcting the Corinthian Christians on a number of issues. Some of them he's heard about in the grapevine, others that they have written to him about. Amongst the issues recently addressed, you may remember, were the subject of marriage and singleness in chapter 7 and the subject of Christian liberty in chapters 8 through to 10. But now that we have reached chapter 11, it seems that Paul is now turning his attention to certain issues that have arisen on those occasions when they gather together as a Christian church, when they meet together. And that will be the focus now through to the end of chapter 14. And although Paul will be correcting them on a number of things in this section of the letter, he does want to give them credit where credit is due. And so he praises them in chapter 11, verse 2, for remembering him in everything and for holding to the teachings just as I passed them on to you. Now, if you look at the footnote of the NIV, or if you have an ESV, you'll see that the word teachings can be also translated as traditions. And that has led some people to dismiss the content of this passage as nothing more than a first century church tradition, a tradition which we are no longer compelled to follow. But that is not what the word teachings or traditions means in verse 2. It is a word which says more about the means of communicating something than it does about the content of what is communicated. It's a word which indicates that some truth or principle is being handed down from one person to another. It is the same word, and I'll give you two references within 1 Corinthians that demonstrates the use of the word. It is the same word that is used in chapter 11, verse 23, translated in English as, what I passed on to you. You have it again in chapter 15, verse 3, for what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins. Now, in both of those references, we wouldn't say, oh, it's traditions, and therefore we don't need to worry about it. As you can see from those two occurrences of the word, verse 2 does not allow us to dismiss this passage as mere tradition. Instead, Paul is commending the Corinthians in verse 2 for holding on to what he has passed on to them. And yet there were aspects of church life in which they were obviously starting to drift on, and it appears that one of those was the role of men and women within the local church. And that is why, having praised them in verse 2, Paul says in verse 3, but I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Now, some people would tell us that the significance of the word head in the New Testament is that it indicates the source of something. And we sometimes do use the word in that way. For example, the head of the River Severn. You know what I mean by that? The head of the River Severn is in the peat bogs of West Wales. While others would tell us that the significance of the word head in the New Testament is not that it indicates a source, but that it indicates a position of authority. And we are perfectly used to using it in that way as well in English. For example, the head of the school is Mr. Jones. He's not the source of the school, but he's in a position of authority over the school. We identify people like Joe Biden as a head of state, in that he occupies a position of authority, and that appears to be the sense in which Paul is using the word head in this passage. And I say that because verse 3 also tells us the head of Christ is God. The head of Christ is God, not in the sense that God is the source of Christ, but in the sense that God the Father is in a position of authority over God the Son, or as we are perhaps more used to expressing it, God the Son has submitted himself to the authority of God the Father for the purposes of redemption, as Jesus himself says in John chapter 6, verse 38, where he says, I've not come to do my own will, but to do the will of him who sent me. Paul will also use the word head in a very similar way in 1 Corinthians. He won't use the word head, but he'll express a similar truth in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 28. And that comparison between God the Father and God the Son, it not only helps us to understand how we should understand the word head, but it also teaches us another important principle on the subject of headship, and that is that biblical headship, and please note this, biblical headship has nothing whatsoever to do with superiority or inferiority. If we believe that God the Father and God the Son are co-equal, then we must assume that the headship of 1 Corinthians 11 verse 3 does not contradict equality in any way or convey inequality in terms of being. As you probably know, if there's been one word that has dominated political discussion and social policy over recent years, it is the word equality. Our politicians of the 21st century, they use the word as if they've discovered a new concept. But what they don't realise is that equality is something that the Bible has taught for thousands of years. Read the opening chapters of Genesis, and you will see that the man and the woman were created equal in God's sight. Both were created in the image and likeness of God. Both the man and the woman were created in the image and likeness of God, and therefore both are equal in terms of worth and dignity. And that was the teaching of the Apostle Paul at a time when such teaching was very countercultural. But what the Bible also teaches is that although men and women are equal, they are different. They are different in the roles and responsibility which their Creator has given them, both within the marriage relationship and within the local church. Within both contexts, it is the man who's been given the position of authority and the responsibility of leadership. That is what Paul means when he says in verse 3 that the head of the woman is man. Well, as Paul indicates in verses 11 and 12, the man and the woman need one another. In the Lord, the one is never independent of the other. And the way in which Paul illustrates that is that just as women came from man originally, you remember what happened in Genesis? Just as the women came from man originally, man has subsequently been born of woman. And so male and female need one another in creation and also within the context of the local church. But although there is that interdependence between male and female, that is not to say that both have identical roles and responsibilities. Within the context of the church, it is the man who's been given authority and the responsibility of leadership. That is why, in giving his qualifications for church leadership, that is why Paul always assumes that those in positions of leadership and authority within the church will be male. Have you noticed that? And that is why he says in 1 Timothy 2, as we discovered in our first reading, that within the context of the local church, he does not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. Now, as you can appreciate, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that such teaching is considered to be way out of date and way off the mark in 21st century modern Western society. Most people within our society, and many within the professing Christian church, would hold to what is commonly known as an egalitarian view of the sexes. An egalitarian view of the sexes, and the egalitarian view says that men and women are equal in every respect, including their roles and responsibilities within the home and within the church. But there is also another view, a complementarian view, which says that although men and women are equal in worth and dignity, they are different. And as such have different roles and responsibilities within the home and the church, roles and responsibilities which complement one another. Their differences complement one another. And the egalitarians, they dismiss the whole idea of male headship, either in 1 Timothy 2 or 1 Corinthians 11. They dismiss the whole idea as being merely cultural. They tell us that Paul was just a man of his times, influenced by his surroundings, influenced by his culture, and that is why he says what he says. But if you look at what Paul says in such passages as 1 Timothy 2, you will see that his argument is not based on culture, it's based on creation. As a church, we believe in the complementarian view of the sexes because that is what we believe the Bible teaches, and the biblical teaching on it has its roots in creation rather than culture. And as Paul demonstrates here in 1 Corinthians 11 verse 3, the concept of headship even predates creation, because it is something that can also be seen amongst the persons of the eternal and triune God. The head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Not something to be dismissed as cultural. That is the biblical principle of headship. Moving on, secondly, we'll consider the God-given symbol of headship. The God-given symbol of headship. Now, having established the God-given principle of male headship, Paul goes on in verses 4 and 5 to explain one of the ways in which that distinction between male and female ought to be evident within the context of the local church. Here is what Paul says. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonours his head, and every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonours her head. Now, there are a couple of issues, at least a couple of issues, which people disagree over in these verses. The first is whether the reference to man and woman throughout this passage are references to men and women generally within the context of the church, or are they a more specific reference to husbands and wives within the context of the church. The words that are used can refer to both options, and that is why the ESV translates woman as wife in verse 5. Personally, I take it to mean man and woman rather than husband and wife, and my reason for doing so is that the marriage relationship was discussed in considerable detail back in chapter 7. There was no mention of this issue back there, and there is no indication that that is still the dominant relationship that is in view here. It seems to me that we've moved on from the marriage relationship of chapter 7, and from chapter 11 onwards, Paul is discussing relationships generally within the context of the church, and in the case of this passage, the relationship between believing men and believing women within the church. Paul is speaking about our relationships, to use his language in verse 11. Paul is speaking about our relationships in the Lord. In the Lord. The second issue people disagree over in these verses is the precise nature of the covering that Paul refers to in verses 4 and 5. Some people take it to mean an additional man-made covering of some kind, such as a veil or a scarf, or as was common in this country in the past, a hat of varying sizes and descriptions. But others take the covering to be long hair, as indicated by the long footnote in the NIV, which if you have an NIV and you look at the footnote for verses 4 and 5, you will see that that is the alternative that it gives. Literally, the phrase translated as covering means to have down from the head. And some of the indications in the passage that I believe would point in favour of it referring to long hair as opposed to an additional covering of some kind, some of the indications in the passage that that is what it is referring to are as follows. Firstly, the common word for veil, which is what some people think Paul is asking for in 1 Corinthians 11, the common word for veil is never used throughout this passage. Not once. Even although such a word did exist, and Paul knew of it, as he demonstrates in 2 Corinthians 3, verses 13 to 16, where he talks about a veil. If an additional covering such as a veil was what Paul was asking for in this passage, then why did he not use that word? Secondly, at the end of verse 5 and in verse 6, there is a similarity drawn between a woman whose head is uncovered and a woman who has her hair completely shaved. As far as I can see, the similarity makes more sense if the covering is long hair. And therefore, what Paul is saying is that if the woman doesn't have a long hair, she might as well go the whole way and have her head shaved. Whereas to say that if a woman doesn't wear an additional covering, such as a scarf or a hat, then she should have her hair shaved, doesn't quite make as much sense as far as I can see. The contrast throughout verses 4 to 6 seems to be a contrast between short and long hair. Thirdly, the other indicator that points to long hair being the covering is that by the time we get to verses 13 to 15, the contrast is certainly between short and long hair. In verse 13, Paul says, "Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered?" And please note, the word translated uncovered in verse 13 is the same word that is translated as uncovered in verse 5, and so Paul is still talking about the same issue. And what answer does he provide to his own question about a woman praying uncovered? Verse 14, "Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair?" Verse 15, "But if a woman has long hair?" His answer to the question about a woman having her head covered in verse 13 is all about long hair. In verse 14, we are told that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for long hair is given to her as a covering. And so, having insisted on the woman having a covering in verse 5, he now says in verse 15 that her long hair is given to her as a covering. Now, I ought to point out that the word covering in verse 15 is not the exact same word as the word translated as covering in the first part of the chapter. But although it is not the exact same word, it seems that the contrast between the man and the woman in verses 14 and 15 is simply reinforcing the contrast that was made between the man and the woman back in verses 4 and 5. If it's not the same contrast, then Paul is making two separate and distinct arguments in this passage, rather than one coherent argument, if it's not the same contrast. Does not the fact that he condemns long hair in the case of a man in verse 14 and commends long hair in the case of a woman in verse 15, does that not suggest that that is precisely what he was asking for back in verses 4 to 6? I.e., a distinction between short hair in the case of the man and long hair in the case of the woman. And so for those reasons, I take it that a woman's long hair is the covering that Paul was asking for in verses 5 and is arguing for throughout the passage. And his reason for doing so was because if the man and the woman don't follow this pattern within the context of the local church, then both, says Paul, dishonour their heads. Not their literal physical heads, but their God-given metaphorical heads, as described in verse 3, which in the case of the man is Christ, and in the case of the woman is man. And so whatever the reasons were for Paul addressing this issue in Corinth, whatever the reasons, and it may have been that some of the women in the church there thought that their newfound Christian freedom allowed them to ignore the differences between the sexes and to do all that the men were doing within the church. That is one possibility. But whatever the reason for Paul addressing it, what he is saying is that although men and women are equal in creation and equal in Christ, there is a difference. There is a distinction to be made between the sexes. The head of the woman is man, and one of the ways in which that headship will be acknowledged in the life of the local congregation is by verse 10, the woman having a sign or symbol of authority upon her head, i.e. a symbol which acknowledges the authority of the man to which she submits within the local church. And that symbolism, it seems, was evident in the length of her hair compared to that of the men's within the congregation. That is the God-given symbol of headship. Thirdly and finally, we are going to look at the continuing significance of the God-given symbol of headship. Now, if you read any commentaries in this passage, then you'll discover that apart from the issue of whether it's long hair or an additional covering, apart from that issue, you'll discover that many of the commentaries say something similar to what I've said this morning. But although that is the case, the vast majority of them, including the one that I quoted in my introduction, the vast majority of them will close by saying something like this, quote, "While the cultural symbols may change, the principles do not." End of quote. In other words, they say what Paul is doing here is teaching a general principle of headship, and it's up to you how that is worked out and how that is symbolized within your cultural context. Others will go to great lengths to explain male and female dress codes in Corinth. It's funny, we know far more about those things about Corinth than we do about any other city in first century times. Why is that? They'll go to great lengths to explain male and female dress codes in Corinth, first century Corinth, or male and female hairstyles within first century Corinth, as if that is the explanation as to why Paul says what he says in this passage. Personally, I'm not persuaded by those cultural attempts to explain away this passage. And the reason I'm not is because of several things that Paul says in these verses. Firstly, did you notice how Paul brings his teaching on this to a close in verse 16? If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. And what those words indicate is that what Paul has taught in this passage is not merely Corinthian culture. All this about examining and the research into Corinthian culture, it is a wild goose chase. For the simple reason that all the churches of God back then, regardless of where they were situated, all the churches of God back then, according to Paul, followed this teaching. Yes, it may have been a specific issue within the Corinthian church that caused Paul to address the matter, but what he prescribes in addressing it is not an exclusively Corinthian cultural practice. All the churches, Ephesus, Rome, Galatia, Colossae, they were all following this. Secondly, if you look at verses 7 to 10, you'll see that Paul's argument for covering or not covering the head in public worship is based not on culture, but on creation. Verse 7, a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. Did you hear that? The image and glory of God. That doesn't sound to me like Corinthian cultural language. Does it sound to you like that? It sounds surely much more like creation language. Is it not? It is because of what the man is in creation that he shouldn't have his head covered in public worship. Likewise, end of verse 7, but the woman is the glory of man, for man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. And did you notice how verse 10 begins? For this reason. I.e., the reason just given in verses 8 and 9. For this reason, the woman ought to have a sign of authority on her head. Please note, it is not only Paul's argument for headship that is rooted in creation. His argument for head covering is also rooted in creation. Writing in 1 Timothy 2, verse 12, if we could have it up on the screen just to remind you, Paul says, 1 Timothy 2, verse 12, he says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. For what reason, Paul? For what reason? For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And when the egalitarians come along and they tell us that Paul's ban on women preachers was just shaped by first century culture, what do we complementarians say in response? We say to them, no, you've misread what Paul's saying. We say it's not based on culture. His argument is based on creation. And yet when we come to 1 Corinthians 11, we say it's cultural. When his argument for head coverings has the very same creation basis to it as his argument in 1 Timothy 2 did. Doesn't that sound like a little bit of an inconsistency on our part? Of course it does. And that's why the egalitarians point to 1 Corinthians 11 and they label it as the great complementarian inconsistency. Because they say, as complementarians, you're being inconsistent. In 1 Timothy 2, you say it's not cultural, it's creation. But in 1 Corinthians 11, you say it's culture, when it's clearly creation. Thirdly, the other reason Paul gives for his teaching on head coverings in verse 10 is because of the angels. Now, like most of the commentaries, I must confess that I don't have an explanation for that one. But what I will say is that heaven's angels are not culturally conditioned. And therefore, what an angel expected to see as he looked down on a congregation of God's people in Corinth would have been the same as what he expected to see as he looked down on a congregation of God's people in Colossae. It would have been the same as he would have expected to see as he looked down on a congregation of God's people in Ephesus, or Exeter, or Edinburgh. And that is a visible distinction between the man and the women of the congregation. A visible distinction in the length of their hair. Fourthly, Paul appeals in verse 14 to the very nature of things. He says in verse 13, judge for yourselves. Verse 13, is it proper for a man to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you? Now, precisely what the nature of things actually is is open to debate. Is it a reference to nature, what we normally consider to be nature, and therefore a universal thing, or is it a reference to long-standing, generally accepted customs? Well, whatever Paul meant by his use of the word nature, whatever he meant by that, he obviously thought it was yet another convincing strand to his argument for the men to have short hair and the women to have long hair. Whatever it was, he obviously thought it was a strong case. And the fact that he finishes that part of his argument, the part of his argument based on what does the nature of things teach you, the fact that he finishes that particular part of his argument by saying that the long hair is the woman's glory, whatever you think the nature of things is, Paul says that's what the nature of things teach you. That the long hair is the woman's glory, when the word glory was used in verse 7 in the context of creation. It would suggest that the nature of things referred to in verse 14 is much more than just culture or custom, but is instead a continuation of his argument throughout the passage, which, don't forget, has been an argument based primarily on creation. Likewise, when he says at the end of verse 15 that long hair has been given to the woman as a covering, who do we understand to have done the giving? The verse says that long hair has been given to her as a covering. Who do we understand to have done the giving? Was this something given to first century women by the culture or custom of their day? In view of what has already been said in the passage about creation, surely he means given to her by God. And therefore, regardless of what changes take place in culture or custom, her long hair is a permanent and an abiding giving. Note the play on words. It is a permanent and abiding giving, something given to her by God. And so for those reasons, if I can just say in conclusion, for those reasons it seems to me that we cannot just pick out the principle of headship in verse 3 of this passage, cling to that, bang on about that, and dismiss the remaining 13 verses as cultural or Corinthian. As far as I can see, we cannot do that. Instead, it is better to see that Paul's teaching on both headship and its God-given symbolism have abiding and continuing significance because they're both rooted in creation rather than culture.